Welcome to our Fermentation Fest speaker series. Our current speakers are Darra Goldstein and Cortney Burns. And just a little bit about our two speakers. I'm losing all my signs here. Sorry about that. Thank you.
It's running.
Darra Goldstein is the founding editor of Gastronomica, the Journal of Food and Culture. She's also the Wilcox B. and Harriet M. Adsit Professor of Russian Emerita at Williams College. She's the author of 5 cookbooks and has been published widely on food, literature, culture, and art. The new cookbook, Beyond the North Wind, Russia in Recipes and More, will appear in February 2020. Darra's list of professional and culinary adventures, accomplishments, and accolades is impressive, and I stop here simply so that we can introduce her colleague and turn the stage over to them as soon as possible. Cortney Burns is equally impressive and must therefore be equally and unfairly shortened for the sake of time. A native Midwesterner, she has traveled extensively to Nepal and India, then to San Francisco, Idaho, Seattle, and Hawaii. In 2011, Burns returned to California to open a series of restaurants with coach chef Nick Bala. Burns has since moved back to the East Coast, first to curate a food program for a 55-acre hotel property in North Adams, Massachusetts, and then to finish a new book, Nourish Me Home, which will be published in spring 2020. In today's presentation and demo, Darra and Cortney will lead us in an exploration of the traditional ferments of Russia and Central Europe and the interplay between necessity and creativity. Darra and Cortney will show how the techniques of food preservation, once crucial for survival, have inspired a culinary inventiveness that pushes culinary culture forward.
Thank you, Mark. So, thank you all for coming. We don't have a lot of time, and obviously fermentation takes time. So we're not going to show the whole process, but we're going to show little bits of things. We would very much like you to ask questions as we're talking rather than saving everything to the end in a formal question and answer period. So I'm going to start off because the Russian process is older than the peppers, which came from the New World. So we're going to start back in the Old World, and then we'll turn it over to Cortney. So I thought that it would be, how many of you are familiar with kvass? Oh, okay, that's pretty good. What we have here to start with is some beet kvass from Real Pickles, and they're going to pass it around. As you know, Russia is a cold country. Unfortunately, it's not as cold as it once was with climate change, and the permafrost is melting. But it still has a really harsh climate and not very good soil. So historically, it has had to rely on a lot of root vegetables. There haven't been grapes that grow there, for instance, so you can't have fermented beverages like wine. But you can take beets, which have wonderful sweetness, and you can make a beautiful kvass from it. All you do is take some beets, scrub them, put them in a crock, cover them with water, and you leave them to sit for about 2 weeks. Some foam, I like to call it scum, but my editor, when I had the recipe for it and called it scum, she's like, she crosses out scum and she puts foam. People don't want to know about scum. There really is kind of scum, foamy scum. It's not bad for you, just scrape it off, and within about 2 weeks, you are left with this beautiful, beautiful, brilliant magenta, very intensely beet-flavored kvass. It's as basic as it gets. In the Jewish tradition, this is called rossel. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with rossel. Well, rossel is the Yiddish word, and it's used as a basis for borscht. And instead of making borscht with water, if you add this as the liquid that you then boil the vegetables in, and sometimes meat if you want meat, it just transcends any other borscht that you've ever tasted. The word rossel itself comes from the Russian rossol, which simply means brine. So you have that wonderful linguistic connection. The basic Russian kvass is actually made not from beets, but from bread. And how many of you have had the standard Russian kvass made from bread? If you buy it in the United States, it can be pretty awful. It tastes like a sort of bready cream soda. If you can imagine that, it's bad. It's way too sweet. But what the traditional one is no bread was ever supposed to go to waste. And so you took the stale bread, you allowed it to get stale, or you can toast it, and then you ferment that bread, you soak it in water, you add a little bit of honey to it if you want to, you don't have to. You add all kinds of different herbs to it. They used to make two different kinds. One was a so-called red kvass, which simply meant that it was darker in color. And they took what was essentially the mash, the toasted bread that had been soaked in water, and then they let it steam in the big masonry stove that the Russians traditionally used for all of their baking. And they infused it with various herbs like mint or St. John's wort, which is supposed to be a very calming sort of thing. They also made a so-called white kvass, which didn't turn out to be quite as dark because it wasn't steamed in the oven. It was just allowed to ferment on the counter. And that was much more delicate, and it was usually flavored with things like violets and somewhat more aromatic floral ones. And then that fermentation takes anywhere from 12 hours to a couple of days, depending on the ambient temperature, and you have this beautiful bready toasted liquid that is really healthy, and that is what the Russians were drinking until hops were introduced from Lithuania in about the 14th century. And the Russians went sort of crazy for hops and started making beer. There was a prohibition against them after their initial introduction because they were considered to be the fruit of the devil because everyone was going sort of wild. But the Russians continued to make kvass. So what I'm talking about today, and we passed out the recipes so you can take it home and try it yourself. It's the perfect season. It's late raspberry season now. And one of my favorite Russian summer drinks is raspberry kvass. And all you do is you take a quart of raspberries, which is about 3 little 6-ounce punnets, as they would call them in England, and you boil them with water, mash them and boil them. Just bring it to a boil, and then you let it sit and cool to room temperature. Warm room temperature. At that point, you stir in a little bit of honey. And I should have done this when this was warm, but I drove here from the Berkshires and I couldn't really keep everything at exactly the right temperature. So this honey might not actually dissolve as well as I want it to, but you get the idea. So the liquid is still somewhat warm, and you stir it, and actually that's doing pretty well. Then you take just a teaspoon of yeast, instant yeast, and you add just a little bit of this liquid. And the yeast just helps jumpstart it. Allow it to foam. Make sure that there aren't any clumps left. And you can let it sit for a few minutes if you want, but you don't have to, and I don't have a whisk here. So you'll be working.
You're whisking beautifully.
Yeah, it's still a little bit clumped.
Did you strain the raspberries with the fluid?
I did, I'm sorry. I did strain it, yeah.
You can strain it and then you can get rid of the seeds. It's just all the rest of the pulp and the swarm will already go through into the liquid, so you're really getting all of that flavor and all of that aroma back into the water.
Yeah. Okay, so this is good. So then I just pour this in. And already it's starting to get happy and bubble a little bit. And then you cover it with cheesecloth. And I actually like to let a little bit more air in. And let it sit on the counter for about 12 hours. Again, it's all going to depend on what the temperature in your kitchen is. The thing about fermentation, as all of you who work with it know, is that it all depends on ambient temperature, so there's always a range. Did you have a question?
Yes, could you use maple syrup instead of honey?
I think you could. I mean, it wouldn't be Russian, but I think it would be a lot of people use sugar. In Russia these days, sadly, even though Russia was one of the great exporters of honey in the entire world and is famous for its beautiful honey, it's a lot more expensive than sugar, so people will throw sugar in. But any sweetener to jumpstart it. And then after about 12 hours, you get about 3 of these swing top containers and drop 3 raisins in. I think you could drop 4 in if you wanted to. I think of 3 as a magical number, magical thinking. And then obviously you take a funnel, and I'm not going to do that because I want this to ferment for 12 hours. And then you pour it into this. You let it ferment a little longer and then refrigerate it. It gets nicely effervescent. It's bubbly. It's so refreshing. It's like a raspberry lemonade, but with a slightly sour flavor to it. So I have kept it in the refrigerator. If you have it stoppered, it'll last for quite a few weeks.
Could you use your choice of yeast?
I think you could. Any yeast that will just activate it, and you can use your choice of berry as well. I mean, a blackberry kvass would be really, really beautiful. Strawberry, the Russians use a lot of cranberry. You can do with pears, you can do with apples. Again, you're going to want to play with different proportions, but you can really take any kind of fruit, just break it down, boil it, strain it, add a little bit of sweetener and a little bit of yeast, and you can make a fruit kvass. The monks in Russia were very famous for their kvasses, and they had huge cellars filled with all different, lingonberry was another favorite one. Yeah.
Are you concerned about the pressure building up in the glass bottle?
Well, you know, this is a very light one. It never gets hugely effervescent. The bread kvass, yes, you have to, as it's building up, periodically, every few hours, you want to open it and let some of the gas out. The Russians have an amazing drink that was sort of lost after the Russian Revolution that literally translates as sour cabbage soup. It's kislyishchi, if any of you know Russian.
It's not a drink, it's a soup, sorry.
No, it's not. It is not. Because shchi is the soup, kislyishchi is the beverage that is an effervescent kvass. And so as I'm reading Russian literature in Gogol's Dead Souls, they're saying they're having this kislyishchi, this literally sour cabbage soup, as a nightcap. I'm thinking, who's having cabbage soup as a nightcap? It turns out, yeah. But it is a bread kvass that is made with malted grains. So you take malted barley, malted rye, and malted wheat, and you allow that to ferment as opposed to just starting with the bread. And it gets really, really bubbly. There's a recipe for it in my book coming up. And this recipe had to be resurrected because it was sort of lost. But yes, that one is really in danger of exploding if you're not careful.
If that happens, one of the best ways to go about it is to put a bowl on top of it, or you can grab a larger container, open it, and then just let it come out. Instead of it hitting the ceiling, you can kind of put an umbrella on top of it and then give it a twist instead of getting it all over yourself.
I was going to say also, if you put a plastic Ziploc on top and then open it into the bowl.
There you go.
Just don't do it, right in front of your. Yeah, we have a frost-covered ceiling. Makes nice patterns.
Do you use sourdough starter instead of yeast?
Again, you can try it and see what happens. Have you ever?
I haven't done
done
a
a
sourdough starter, no. And the yeast, you can harvest it off of like any sort of fruit that hasn't been cooked as well. So you can do wild yeast fermentation on it. It'll just take a little bit longer. So there's ways to activate it. But yeah, by all means, it would definitely have an activation factor because you have this really active band going on. So you can start with that and then add in a bit of sweetener just to give it some food. Yeah, you should have an activation with that, no problem.
Technically, that's what the raisins are.
Yeah, in secondary fermentation, yep, it's just a little extra food.
Yeah.
Dried fruit, raisins, yep.
And yeast.
The thing about the sourdough starter, I would just wonder about the flavor profile afterwards, that it might get a little bit more on the sour side, but that might be desirable.
Yeah, I did a bread kvass with
Uh-huh.
the sourdough starter.
Oh, yeah, with
And
the
it-
bread kvass, that would
Yeah,
be,
and it
yeah.
worked really nice. I was just wondering with this one.
I'm
yeah,
not
there
sure
would
that I would
be
do with this,
this
just
flavor
in terms of flavor, but with the bread kvass, they always saved the bread that they had already soaked, they saved a little bit out to make the next batch, so you can keep that going and going.
If you do want fruit in some of those more kind of toasty bread aroma kvasses, I would go with like pear or apple or like a dried prune or some raisins or something like that, which you would get some of that fruitiness, but it would kind of stay within that same flavor profile and not muddy this like lovely floral aromatic you have going on.
Yeah. This is a lot lighter than all the other kvasses. So we're going to move west from Russia now, and Courtney's going to take over and talk about peppers.
Sure. We'll talk about peppers and a little bit about some sauerkraut that we're going to have to taste too. That's been lovingly donated for us today. But just to really kind of skirt the two and talk about fermentation in general, which, assuming you're all sitting here, you really know a fair bit about already, but looking at it through the lens of necessity versus creativity. And Darra really touched on that, especially in Eastern Europe, Russia, and places like that, like with a very short growing season and, like I said, soil that's not as rich and abundant as something that we get here, there really becomes a necessity behind fermented foods. And I really think it's something to touch on here, especially, and to nod to, because today we really get to be creative with our ferments. There is a layer of necessity involved with what we do, especially here in Zone 5. We have a very short growing season. We have the luxury of having ingredients short all the time, and we may not think about seasonality, in that way, because we don't necessarily have to. But if we tap into what's really going on with food and when we can harvest it, we really start to see that we only have certain things for moments in time. And so it's not only that we want to create tomatoes or peppers that can necessarily, that we want those flavors to be eaten fresh, in the middle of winter, but it's prolonging those seasons. It's really creating some, the aspect of seasonless kitchen into what we're doing today. And if we honor tradition and honor what we had and where it was coming from, we can look at the necessity behind preservation and then the luxury that we get as, cooks or, anyone interested in food today, and we get to be, creative with it. And so it's really looking at the interplay between those two things. And what Darra is talking about here and this kind of very old world beverage and how it's transitioned today, like the beet kvass that you guys drank is being made currently today in a place where we can have beets all the time. And to just honor the history of it for a moment and really start to see how that layers in, I find to be really important in everything that we do. So, I think it's a very important little piece to talk about, and I think about it from the culinary standpoint, having worked in kitchens and restaurants for years, that I get this luxury of ingredients and I get this luxury of play. And so part of it is to say, let's honor tradition and let's understand it, but let's also take it and start to play with it a little bit because we get to. And so we're very fortunate that we get to play with a very old world technique that was mostly out of necessity, and now we get to take necessity, utilize it as such, and turn it into creativity. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that plays into the little demo we're going to talk about here today. But historically, like you said, we're moving west, and it is, peppers come from the New World. You could probably give a better historical reference than I can, but in basically peppers came from the New World back
Through Turkey
right
to Hungary.
Right. So what was it in like 1453? Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and therefore the trade routes changed. They weren't able to get to India through the Silk Road anymore, through the spice trade routes anymore. So they had to go around through, it's like the Cape of Good Hope, but then back again to actually come back around to be able to trade. And was it the Europeans that weren't able to trade with Spain? So they had to go through the Ottomans. So there was this whole kind of gist and bob and weave going on between getting peppers. But during that traversing of the Cape of Good Hope, Columbus was run into. And Columbus, basically in that trajectory, landed in America. And then peppers through, with the colonization of Central and South America, peppers were brought up, they were moved over to Spain, they were moved over to Turkey. But in order to get them east, they had to go through the trade routes with the Ottomans. Am I correct?
Well,
I'm sure she could dial it in just a little bit.
yeah, it's basically, that was the trajectory coming from the New World and then going through Turkey and through the big trade nexus there. And from there it penetrated north into the Balkans. And but the peppers found amazingly, we talk a lot about terroir.
Yep.
And so the soil in Hungary was particularly well suited to grow the most flavorful peppers. And they, as you'll talk about, developed methods for drying them that really made them sing.
Absolutely. So they say that it's one of the most well-traveled spices throughout the entire world, peppers in general. And they've become, in Hungary specifically, it's like the national spice, which is kind of fascinating. I mean, I don't know what our national spice would be here, but it wouldn't be peppers. I mean, it could be. So this is just looking at one way to really take abundance, make it into something that is a little more manageable, make it smaller, but also make it even more flavorful. So as we look at all these different ways of preserving things, we're not only preserving them because a glut is very large, and this would probably break down and we'd end up with this. So we have the ability to preserve something. We also are taking something that's perishable through the act of fermentation. We're preserving it, and then we're also harnessing all these other amazing microbes that make it that much more nutritionally beneficial for us. So through all of these layers of necessity, we also come out the other side with this like deep medicine in a lot of ways. So it's a beautiful dance that's happening through the art of preservation itself. So this is just one way to kind of talk about it. So what we're doing is if we look at Hungary and we look at this sort of historical traversing of these spices, and then this land that was so apt and ready to grow this beautiful spice, they end up with far more than they could ever export mainly, but then they're importing other ones as well for seeds and all of these things. So that kind of goes even farther into it. But one of the things that you'll see all over Hungary and now other parts of Eastern Europe are these tubes of pepper paste, much like we would think of mustard or ketchup. You see these tubes of pepper paste that you can buy at like every corner store throughout Hungary itself. And so they've found a way to not only dry the peppers, which is the most beautiful dried paprika coming from Hungary, the oil contents are really, really high. And then they're also pureeing them, fermenting them, drying them as a preservation technique as well. And it's become really the essence of a lot of the flavors in the cuisine. So they've been able to take what they're able to grow, a lot of potatoes and cabbage and all these things, through a lot of Turkish influence, create these flavors that just burst in a different way than they did, a long time ago. So we're not going to do a huge demo, but basically these peppers, any peppers that you can get, this variety is sweet. You can do it with sweet, spicy. You can mix them. You can char them. But when the universe gives you too many, you can seed them and puree them. From there, you weigh it. So this ended up being 1,200 grams of pepper puree, and to that, I add 1.5% salt. And that may sound low if you're really used to doing a lot of lactic ferments, but because we're going to reduce it, if we do anything higher than that, you're going to end up with something so salinated that it's not really fun to eat. So we would add this guy to this, and then this is a little bit of brine from a ferment that I have going at home. And so what I like to do in a similar way to the seed miso you're talking about is it's called slopping. So it's a lovely term, much like scum. We're going to slop this back. I'm sure there's a better way to say that. We're taking what we know to be a really happy lactic, ferment, and adding it into here so that we're coaxing all of that good bacteria to be what we get from the beginning. And so I'd add a splash of that, and if you don't have it, It's not the end of the world, but if you do, it's basically just cheating. And it's the best way.
Was that like whey that was in there?
This one's not. You could use where you're going to get different bacteria strains, but it is an inactive medium, so you're jump starting nonetheless. This is just a brine left over from some fermented squash that we have going at home because that is also wildly abundant. So we're just pickling it all. So yeah, that's all that is, and this is a really happy brine. But you see that cloudiness. If you're fermenting cucumbers or you're fermenting really anything, once that brine becomes a little cloudy, you know that that lactic acid bacteria has really taken over. So it's a sure sign that
But you
it's
could
really
use
viscous. That
whey
you're
from
kind of,
kefir.
what's that?
Could you use whey from kefir?
You could. It will jumpstart the active medium. Lactobacillus is not necessarily the first bacteria strain that you have in there, but it's definitely there. So by all means, anything you can do to just say like, go ahead, do all of the good things. Yeah, it's not going to hurt it. So once this is pureed, I'll leave it out. Often I'll put it in a crock like this. You can throw a little an airlock on here. What you're doing with that is ostensibly you're creating an anaerobic environment, and what the byproduct of fermentation is carbon dioxide. Same issue is going on here. But those little picklers, or those little airlocks, allow the CO2 to come out without any oxygen going in. What that's doing is it's also just thwarting mold. So you don't have to have that again. I like it because it's like cheating. I don't have to pay attention to my little babies as much. And this does the same thing with a little water well in here. So this will go for about a week to 7 days, just till it's gently sour. You can let it go farther than that. You'll want to watch it with that salt level being a little bit lower. And then from there, what I do is I just spread it out into a baking dish. I like to do it in a dehydrator, and then just bring it down until it's like the texture of tomato paste. You can do it in a low oven with a pilot light on as well. So we're taking a glut, turning it into something super concentrated. With all the water activity pulled out, you're taking all the flavors of those peppers and really just concentrating them down into a paste. That ends up being, for me, the base of harissa. It ends up being the base for sauerkraut stew. It ends up
She makes the most awesome
My
sauerkraut
favorite
stew I've ever tasted, by the way.
and that is quite a compliment from Darra. So it ends up, you can see how thick it is, and you can use it in so many different ways, much like a tomato paste, but just with all of the flavor of the pepper. But you're also getting all of that lactic in there, so you're getting a lot of that sour, and you're getting all of those probiotics as well, as long as you keep your temperature really low. So you guys can taste this. You can just go ahead and eat the whole thing. It's definitely not for the faint of, you can eat it all. This isn't the spicy one. But I also mix this in with sauerkraut, and that's another thing that you can do. And that's where these kind of layers of fermentation, layers of condiments that we make become kind of a creative driving force. So I'm going to taste some sauerkraut as well, just so you can really taste just that straight, lactic acid bacteria, because it's a really clean ferment. And then even if you have a little bit left, you can mix it into that and see what that would taste like if you put them together.
How do you condense it down?
Just in a low oven. So yeah, once it has the flavors that you want and it's nice and sour and active, you can just put it into a baking dish and either put it in an oven that's really low, just watch it, keep moving it around, just with the pilot on. I like to do it in a dehydrator so I can keep it under 105, which allows it to stay nice and raw, and you get to harness all of the nutritive benefits of it as well. And then just watch it. If a little mold comes, you can scrape it off, but just keep mixing it in until it's the texture that you want it to be.
What was the salt percentage?
1.5. You can even do 1, just depends on what you want it to be in the end. This one's a 1.5 that you'll taste.
Once it's dehydrated, then do you put it in the blender? How do you make it into a paste?
So yeah, if you want it, it'll already be into a paste, but if sometimes skins will form as you dry it, and so you can throw it back into a blender or a Cuisinart, and it'll just break that all up again.
We talked about the interplay between necessity and play. Do people know that there's benefits to the fermentation?
So
That's a good
it's the
question.
time of this. If we talk about sauerkraut, which is an interesting, it's an interesting one to look at for that, and I'll touch on it and then add in whatever I'm historically saying wrong. It's like my history buff, and so I'm always nervous to talk about history in front of Darra. But so sauerkraut, we often think of it as an Eastern European ferment, but it's actually, historically, it's not in theory. So the story goes that when the Great Wall of China was being built, shaved cabbage was being fermented with rice wine, because that's what they had. And so that was a way for the non-growing season to be lengthened, but also there was a lot of nutritional benefits that were happening. When Genghis Khan brought it over to Europe, and the Dutch and it was mostly the Dutch, I think, that started fermenting it originally. Is that correct? She'll fix that. They started taking it on on long voyages, and what they started to see is that there weren't as many outbreaks of scurvy. So they started to notice the health benefits of that. I don't know what they actually knew about the science like we do today, and we're continually learning as well. But that's really one of the first documented, kind of health benefits of like sauerkraut for a start.
What I would say in Russia, I mean, most of the country was the peasantry, actually serfs. They weren't educated, but they had a real deep wisdom. And there's a wonderful book that was written in the 19th century by a chemist who was exiled to the country because he was involved in his students' political demonstrations, so he was sent out of St. Petersburg. And he took notes on what he observed among the peasantry. And he said that the only thing that they had to have in their daily diet, I mean, they're working really, they were slaves in effect, was the sour. They could not live without the sour. So sourdough bread, kvass, the pickled, lacto-fermented cabbage, all of these different things. And they could do without everything else, but if they didn't have that, they didn't feel healthy. And they couldn't talk about probiotics or any of this, and even he as a chemist wasn't really onto that, but it was sort of like a deep knowledge that they had. Speaking of this sauerkraut that is coming out now from Hosta Hill, which is in the Berkshires, they do really beautiful ferments. So in Russia, again, it's a traditional lacto-fermented cabbage. So it's basically just shredded cabbage. Do not shred it in the Cuisinart, even though you want to. It is just not going to taste right. You really need to carefully cut it by hand or use a hand grater. It will make a huge difference. The Russians also make something, so this is kvass. They make something called kvashenaya kapusta. It's the same root, which is to ferment. And they just take cabbage and they put salt on it and let it sit for only 2 to 3 days, as opposed to 1 to 2 to 3 weeks. And that gives a very crisp, fresh, summery tasting salad that you still get a bit of that health benefit, but it's not the intensity of sauerkraut.
What's the percentage of salt?
Well, I don't do percentage. I'm just a home cook.
Let's go 1%.
Yeah,
so
so
3 or like 0.5% probably. 2.5,
Yeah.
but on a 3-day?
Yeah, it's about the same proportions that you would use when you're making sauerkraut, but you just don't leave it on as long. And then if you add some brined lingonberries to that, so the Russians do a lot of brining in a very weak salt solution. They do that with tomatoes, they do it with watermelon, which is really awesome. And you just let that sit for 2 or 3 days, and then it's this beautiful, ever so slightly salty and effervescent fruit. So they do that with fruit a lot.
Apples.
Yes, apples. Apples are the classic.
So I might be a tad biased just because I come from a Russian household myself. So when I see a lot of these different recipes, I think of home cooking.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, do you think that a lot of these recipes can become popular in like everyday restaurants in the United States, everyday homes? Do you see a popularization?
These are all in my restaurants in San Francisco, so absolutely. Yeah, this and many, it was the backbone to basically everything that we did. So yeah, and it's becoming more and more well-known and seen more, kind of dispersed more in the restaurant culture for sure. We'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of restaurants today that don't have something fermented going on.
And at home, I mean, this is sort of a select crowd, I would say, because you're all here interested in fermentation. But even people who are sort of afraid of it because they're afraid of mold or they're afraid of spoilage or all those things that Kirsten was talking about earlier, like what she was doing with the beef and letting it sit at 88 degrees. It's like everything your mother told you not to do. The recipes are so easy. They're so basic. They're sort of intuitive. And things like the raspberry kvass or the salted cabbage, you just put it on the counter. It takes care of itself, and then you have something that is really alive.
And something you made. You know,
Yeah,
it's just,
so I think they're quite easy. And my recipes are, I mean, they're geared for the public, so they're easy.
So this cabbage is not pickled, it's just salted?
It's just salted, the
pickled
kvass
cabbage has to be crunchy, right?
It's still crunchy, yeah?
No, the pickled cabbage is crunchy, this is very soft.
Oh,
this one, it's a long aged kraut.
Yeah.
This one's a longer fermented sauerkraut.
this one is, yeah.
If you let it breeze all the time, it's still crunchy for the entire time.
This is a different style
Different
of
style.
sauerkraut.
So this is just salted, it's not pickled.
Well, the Russians, I mean, traditionally did not pickle. They didn't use vinegar. They just,
No.
yeah,
But,
used
but,
salt.
but it's not,
Yeah, this one isn't Russian style.
But it is pickled. It's just pickled.
Yeah.
Just the salt and the cabbage itself creates a lactobacillus, and so that's the pickling agent here, the preservation agent.
So we have about 8 minutes left. We have 5 minutes left for questions.
What kind of peppers were used in that paste that we tasted?
This one's just a mix of sweet peppers, but you can use absolutely anything.
You probably can't see, but here, you know, a traditional bell pepper
Yeah.
just.
But this one that you're tasting, this one's actually made in 2015, so it just kind of speaks volumes for how long these things last. And it was made with probably 15 different peppers. We went to one of the farms that we grew a lot of our produce on outside of San Francisco at the time. It was the last harvest right before the frost was coming, so we picked absolutely everything on any of the vines. Then we took all the walnut shells from the walnuts that we had cracked, and we made a big fire and charred half of them, kept the other half raw, and then that's where this paste comes from.
And so is that now non-perishable, now that that much moisture has been removed?
Yeah, because
So
most
it's
of the water
shelf-stable.
activity has been pulled out, it's shelf stable.
Wow. And once you open it, do you want to put it in the refrigerator?
You know, I haven't had a problem with these ones. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of mold on top, but since I don't have all the room that I want in refrigeration, they just sit out. Yeah, they're fine. These sat through the whole summer in New Hampshire without getting moldy. So I'll do a little bit of parchment right on top or something like that just to keep it at bay. But yeah, no, they stay really stable.
a little bit of what?
Parchment paper, just so that it's flush against it.
Find it better than gauze?
Well, it's closed, so you could have the gauze on there too, but the permeability of the parchment paper is less, so the mold, the propensity for mold to grow is also less.
Or you can also take the parchment and put it right on the surface instead of just over the top of the
That's what I'm
jar.
saying. In storage, I would have parchment underneath the lid here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, what in situations where you have a little bit of mold on the top of something, is it always okay to just take it off and keep going, or should you be nervous sometimes?
I haven't had, there's been a couple instances from a food that really does not look good. And you kind of like trust your gut. If you have black mold, some very strange green mold sometimes, some green molds are fine. A lot of charcuterie has green molds on it and they're lovely. But
Black mold, if you see black mold, don't touch it.
Yeah, get rid of
But
it.
if it's white and if it's sort of, with filaments and
Cauliflower-like?
stuff, yeah, that stuff's fine.
yeah, you can just spray.
Sorry if this is a repeat, I came in late, but as far as the preparation for this, did you ferment the peppers whole, or did you make them into the paste first?
Yeah, pureed.
Okay.
So first top them, seed them,
Yeah.
and then puree them down.
And was it a mix of roasted and raw?
For this one that you tasted, yes, it's a mix of roasted and raw. This one, for sake of showing it all to you, it is just raw, but you can do it both ways. Yeah. And then just 1.5% sulfite weight of the
I got that one.
How long?
This one I do about 5 to 7 days, as long as it's sour, and then you can keep it going.
Sure.
But from there, then just gently bring it down.
Do you have a percentage on the back slop that's in brine, or you just kind of?
Just splash for good measure.
Also, when you said that you dehydrated the pepper after, did you also dehydrate the sauerkraut that you added in there and do it all together?
Oh no, I was saying if you had sauerkraut like the
just
one you
extra.
tasted,
Oh,
and
I
you
see.
also had this,
I thought you mixed
wanted
it
to
into
add
these.
another flavor into that, you could mix it in and then you have
Gotcha.
chili pepper sauerkraut.
Cool.
I'm interested in your book. Do you have them available, and is it mostly just kvass?
Oh, it's not just kvass, although maybe that'll be the next one. No, it's coming out in February.
Oh, okay.
And so there are a lot of different ferments. There's a whole chapter on all sorts of different Russian ferments. So the brining method I talked about, the different kinds of kvass, different fermented vegetables.
Do you have a website I could follow you? Or?
I do have a website. It's darragoldstein.com. And the book, I think it is available on Amazon. The cover is not ready yet, so there's no picture of the cover, but it's available for